Welcome back to the Year of Plenty podcast, the show to help you get closer to your food source and learn the skills to make every year a year of plenty. We are all about building more resilient humans through food here, and I'm pumped to have you along for the ride. Today, we're chatting with James Mann from Spicebush Woodcraft. Now, the conversation you're about to hear is part one of our conversation with James. In part one, we are talking all about hickory nut foraging. Later, I will publish part two, which is all about his DIY thermal greenhouse and kind of how he built it. And he uses that greenhouse to grow everything from vegetables to fruits. All right, that's it for the intro. Get ready to learn all about hickory nuts from James. All right, James, welcome to the Year of Plenty podcast. How's it going?
It's going great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We also got Lindy here again.
Hello, hello.
How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Happy to be
Our
here.
co-host showing herself again. So, James, you are a forager, naturalist, urban homesteader. You do a lot of awesome things. You're basically the ideal person, like the ideal guest for this podcast, because you, as we just talked to you before hitting record, you kind of really enjoy the same things as us and a lot of the audience and try to bring it all under one roof. One big thing we want to talk about here today with you are the hickory nuts, and then later your thermal greenhouse, which I think is super unique and something that I've been wanting to learn more about. And I think it would be really valuable for people to hear about it, especially those living in more of the colder climates who like to garden and have the space to build a greenhouse. But hickory nuts first. I've been kind of trying to do more like deep dives into certain foraged goods, plants and even mushrooms that I think are really abundant on the landscape and that people can really utilize and also, reciprocate, give back, maybe wild tend. We can get into some of that later if you want. But first, to start it off with hickory trees and hickory nuts, I'm curious, like, do you remember your first hickory nut harvest, if at all? And is there a story to it?
Oh yeah, for sure. So I started most of what I foraged for a long time was mushrooms. But as you're out there throughout the year looking for mushrooms, you start finding other things. And you're like, what is that? Or I'm going to learn more about this. And most of the time, you're in the wrong season. Like, say, you'll find evidence of something and it's not good anymore. And you're just like, oh, I missed that. I wonder what it was. So, one time I was out looking for chanterelles, and it was toward the end of the season. And there was just these. I parked underneath these hickory trees, and I knew what a shagbark hickory was, but I'd never really had the nuts from them, or I didn't know if they were any good because the only experience I had with nuts were black walnuts, and the flavor of black walnuts is kind of take it or leave it. I don't know if you guys have black walnuts where you are, but I'm
No.
sure probably not. They like more basic, like soil, and
Mhm.
typically I don't think they come across the continental divide or whatever. But so black walnuts have a very specific taste. It's almost kind of like funky, like blue cheesy in a way. Like, you know what I mean? It's not just a straight up nut taste. It has a kind of aroma to it.
Mhm.
And depending on how you process them, that aroma can be either very strong or if you catch them at the right time and get the right cultivar, it can be, weaker and a little bit more palatable. So black walnuts are a thing you gotta acquired taste, let's say. But hickory nuts, I kind of attributed them to the same. But one year I came out of the woods and there was just a huge pile of hickory nuts at the bottom of this tree. And so I was just like, okay, well, I just gathered a bunch of them up and took them home and did the float test and to see which ones are good or bad. And cracked some open, and man, they're one of the best wild nuts I think I've ever had. They're like a buttery pecan, which is not very surprising because hickories are like a more ancient pecan, basically.
They're in the
And
same
they're
Okay.
family, right?
yeah, they're the same family, and hickories, have been around for millions of years. Even probably I think before oaks, or maybe around the same time as oaks kind of
Wow.
developed. So they're a really, really old nut bearing tree, and we have a few different varieties here in Ohio. But I would say that the one that I am able to harvest most off of and have the best nuts are the shagbark hickories. But there's also
Mm.
shellbark, which are king nuts, some people call them. There are heart nuts and bitter nuts and pig nuts, and there's all kinds of different little variations. Some are really not edible, like bitter nuts, but they can be pressed for oil because these nuts contain like 80% oil in them.
Right.
Wow.
So it could be, and I work with landowners as well. And I try to identify these things on their property because a lot of people see their forest as kind of useless except for timber. And I really believe in non-timber forest products, and something like bitter nut hickory oil could be one of those future products. I know foragers like Sam Thayer, I think, already does hickory nut oil. Um, but it's finding a way to educate people about this because you could make some serious money off your property in an otherwise quote unquote useless land by just knowing what's on your property and knowing that it has value and how you could bring value to it,
Yeah.
so
Mhm.
That's a really good
um,
point, actually.
Yeah.
Especially if it's on your own land, you can kind of choose what you want to do with it. You can harvest them however you want. Obviously, ideally, you want to do it sustainably so that you have more and more in the coming years. But that's a really good point. And I want to get into some of the history later. I found some cool excerpts about the hickory nut oil like that.
Mm.
So you kind of stumbled on the hickory nuts, though, just kind of disregarded them, then just didn't have the best chanterelle harvest as far as I heard it now, and then just kind of saw them and wanted to try them out. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the reason why I probably found them that year is because the trees were going through a masting year, which is when
Right.
they produce more than what they need. But a lot of people don't realize that it's really actually kind of hard to harvest nuts in the forest. Not only is there a ton of debris around, but there's also a bunch of old nuts around, so it's hard to know which one is new and which one is old sometimes. So you end up picking up nuts from the year before that are definitely bad and kind of wasting your time. And also, the squirrels are eating all of the nuts in the forest before they even become ripe a lot of the time. I'll find like, nut hulls that have like a big hole chewed out of them where the squirrels are chewing out. And also, the forest trees don't produce as many nuts anymore because all of our forests are kind of closed canopy right now.
Hmm.
When historically they were more open canopied forest.
Really?
So that because they're closed canopied, there's the sun is only hitting the top of the tree, and so really only the tops of the trees are really producing most of the nuts. So I was lucky to find these in an open grove that is like maintained and mowed basically, and every tree is like a shagbark hickory, but they mow around them. And for me, it kind of clicked with at that point, like, oh, okay, like I need to find trees that are out in the open if I'm ever going to be able to harvest stuff. And
That's a
so a
good
lot of
tip.
my nut, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's and a lot of what I try and do with people, like I do public foraging classes where I kind of teach people about this, like not only about that it is edible, but I want to give people my knowledge on what I've learned over the years on how to actually harvest these things, process them, and use them because it's not enough to be like, yeah, that's edible. Yeah, that's edible. Everyone always says that stuff. You know what I mean? Oh, that's edible. It's like, okay, but that's not an actionable like step really. People
Right.
hear it, it
Right.
goes in one ear, they may be like, oh, that's really cool, and then it goes out the other ear. Versus what I'm trying to do is be like, hey, like we can actually do this. We can actually use these as real food, not a novel food, not some kind of syrup or candy or something like that, but we can actually turn these into the food that they historically have been and what they're meant to be once more. Which is a local, sustainable, renewable resource that is not reliant on cutting trees down, but it's reliant on keeping more trees and managing our forests in a more positive way. If we managed our forests better, we would have more open canopied forests that would produce more nuts and more fruit and more food, essentially. There's not a lot of food in the forest because it's too much shade. And so
Mhm.
if we want more nuts and more fruits and things. I know I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent there, but
No, it's a good
yeah,
tangent.
Go for it.
it's my like mission, my diatribe is kind of like, if only we viewed this stuff in a different way, and if we viewed ourselves as the tenders of nature's garden instead of it being this separate entity, that we can actually create more abundance and more food. The narrative that humans are like a plague to the landscape because all we do is take too much is simply like a little bit ignorant, and we are ignorant because we don't choose to learn more about our landscape enough to. We're kind of too scared right now. We're too scared. We're like, oh, there's a badge of honor that people wear of like, I took the least amount out of the forest, and
Mhm.
it's like, it doesn't have to be that way. We can take what we need from the forest and also give back and not have to feel bad because we took a grocery bag of um, ramps or something out of the forest. It's because we know enough about ramps to be able to spread them while we're collecting them, or we know how to correctly harvest them for the future. And the same thing with nuts. I am at the point now where I want to, like with hickory nuts, if I find really big thin shelled nuts, I'm keeping those because I'm going to plant them.
Yeah.
And that
Right.
way, I'm not ever going to see the fruit from that, but someone else is going to see the fruit from that, and they're going to thank me, or thank somebody, because they have this awesome big nut that is like a pecan, basically, and it has a thin shell, easy to crack, lots of nut meat. And I find those trees in urban areas because most trees in urban areas are cultivars or improved varieties. So I often will suggest people go to urban areas to collect fruit and nuts because a lot of times people have planted an improved variety on accident or something, you know what I mean? But the trees that are out in the open usually have better quality products as well that come off of them. So the main thing that I do is drive around in the fall with my truck, and I collect lawn and leaf bags from people that have hickory trees or walnut trees or acorn trees in their yards. And I just pick them up. I use the leaves for my garden. I use the nuts for me. I discovered that by accident as well. I was getting leaves for my
Yeah.
garden, and one I dumped over some bags, and they were just full of nuts, like completely filled with them. And I was like, wow, that's awesome. So I started looking for the trees I wanted. And as soon as they'd put those bags out, I just put them in the truck, dump them out, pick up all the nuts. And I had bushels of nuts that the homeowner basically collected for me.
Yeah.
Right.
That's such a great, yeah,
Smart.
it's a great strategy. A lot of homeowners have these foods on their property, these trees and plants that are edible, and they don't even know about it. They don't care about it.
They,
So,
they don't care. They
Yeah.
see it as a nuisance. You know what I mean? It's a nuisance because they have to pick them up and they hit their cars and all that stuff. And I totally get that. But I think that if there was some way for, to educate people and say like, hey, like this is a resource that you're throwing out for compost every single year. And, you know, we all buy nuts at the store, like pecans. Like, why there's just the problem is that we get all of our food in this pre-prepared form, basically. Not maybe people like you and me, but like we still get
most,
stuff pre-prepared. But yeah, most people get a lot of their stuff in the final form, and so everything above that or everything in a more raw state is just too much work.
Right.
I teach people about acorns too and how to make acorn flour. And, if we could just be strategic about it, just like picking up these bags instead of going and picking up individual nuts, if we can be strategic about it and we can start to improve the ways we're doing things, improve the way we're harvesting, talking to each other, and someone saying, like, hey, I pick them up in lawn and leaf bags, and giving maybe you the idea of doing that. And now you're doing it and you're like, oh, it's not that hard. I'm going to show other people how to do this in my area. This is
that's
like,
it.
these are the chain reactions, the ripples that I'm trying to hopefully create by sharing, just being obsessed basically, and being obsessed with like finding a better way to do this, because I want to keep finding better ways to do this because I feel like we have to.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Someone has to. And, I'm sure you do that with hunting too, right? Like when you're hunting, it's like, oh man, something didn't work out this year. Or man, how can I improve my hunting so I don't have to be out there as long or work as hard? And this is
Totally.
what humans have
Right.
been doing essentially for thousands and thousands of years. But there's this huge gap between, like, especially on this land, indigenous knowledge of how to eat and prepare these foods and gather these foods. There's a large gap between that. We're working off of someone else's culture. Basically, we're working off our ancestors' culture that doesn't really work here a lot of the times.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
think that a lot of what I do is piece together this knowledge that I've been trying to research and find and say, oh, that is edible if you prepare it in this way or whatever. So same thing with hickory nuts. The Cherokee had Kanochi, which is a hickory nut milk, probably one of
Yep.
the first hickory nut milks ever, the first nut milk ever, plant-based milk. But it was truly a survival food. It is hard to get the nut meat out of these shells sometimes. So they would just pound the entire nut and then cook it down and skim off the fat and mix it up and sweeten it maybe with you know, maple syrup or, some sort of sugar source that they
Honey,
had,
maybe.
honey, or even, persimmon puree or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's truly a survival food because it's 80% fat pretty much. And then the rest is just protein and a little bit of carbohydrate. So, I mean, I think it was a valuable resource for people. And in Georgia, I believe they found these caverns that were deep. There were three different caverns, and there was found evidence that they were once nut silos, basically. Because if
That's
you
cool.
dry
Oh.
the nuts correctly, if you dry acorns correctly or you cure hickory nuts or black walnuts correctly, they can store for a very, very long time.
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to say indefinitely. Maybe acorns could store indefinitely, but given the right temperatures and humidity and all that stuff, if they're cured properly, these nuts can last for a long time.
Yeah.
And that is a very important resource, especially because they mast every 3 to 4 years. And so you're going to have 1 year where you're able to harvest a cave full. And then the next year, there's going to be nothing. Like
Right.
this year, we're
Right.
probably going to get no acorns.
Yeah.
So do you know what the storage process would be? Like how you should dehydrate them, or how are you getting them ready to be
For
stored?
the
Yeah,
hickories
hickory
now?
nuts are actually
Yeah.
pretty. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hickories. Sorry. So sometimes I just go like everything. I feel like is connected to
It
everything. So
is. So
sometimes
it's
it's like you got to talk about this to talk about that. But hickory nuts are one of the easier nuts to cure. So the husk dries up and it falls away in segments. So I think I
Mhm.
sent you a picture. It's like they're like little tiny lemon wedges on the outside of it, on the outside of the
Mhm.
nut. And as they dry up, they kind of just fall away. So you can, a lot of times, by the time they fall out of the tree when they're ripe, the nut husk will just kind of break off. So a lot of times, I can just pick them up right off the ground and not even have to take the husk with me, which is really awesome
Okay.
because black walnuts are like not like that at all. You have to like
Yeah.
physically take the husk off and wash it and power. I have to use a power washer with that, but yeah, and then after that, after you dehusk them, I basically put them in a big like kind of bin that has a ton of holes in it, like a big giant just perforated bin. And I
Okay.
have a fan on them for a couple weeks, and every day I'll go in and kind of just like stir them up a little bit. And in a couple weeks I'll like test one and see how it is. And with hickory nuts, you can actually pretty much eat them right out of the husk.
Mm.
But for long-term storage, you definitely want to cure them. And so, as you cure them, the nut kind of shrinks down and separates from the outer shell, so they're easier to crack. And once they're kind of separated, I know that they're pretty much cured. So after a couple 3 weeks of that fan being on them and me stirring them around, then I'll just transfer them to like a basket that's still perforated, but kind of more enclosed, and then I'll just put them
Mhm.
on a shelf in the basement, and they just stay there all winter long. And I crack
that's
them as I
Huh.
need them.
awesome.
Very cool.
Yeah.
It does take a while to crack them, though. I mean, I'm
I
still
was
trying to
gonna
work on
ask
those
that.
methods. I made a
Did you
hickory
do
nut.
you
Go ahead.
do you have a nutcracker?
Yeah, I bought a one of those Grandpa's Goody Getter, or I got it for
Okay.
my birthday from my girlfriend. But it doesn't work very well for hickory nuts. I think you have to get a
Mm.
special like attachment for them because the hickory nuts are kind of small. It's really for black walnuts. It works on like a cam drive, so like you can just like push it down like a slot machine, and it'll crack them. So I usually just use like a pair of like vice grips basically, and just compromise the shell. And then I have a little pair of nut snips. It's like a little tiny pair of scissors that like
Mm.
pinches the shell of the nut and it breaks it. So once the shell is compromised, it's way weaker than it is when it's whole. Just like an egg, you can squeeze an egg in your hand, and if you put even pressure on it, you can almost not break it. But if you squeeze on it, once the shell is compromised, it crumbles very quickly. So same thing with
Okay.
nuts. So I have a little pair of nut snips. They're like little scissors, and you can kind of snip the nuts, and you put pressure on the shell, and it cracks it away, and then you can separate the nuts out. Um, it does take a while, but what I do is I sit in front of the TV and put a movie on or something, and or like Netflix, and just watch TV and do it, or listen to
Yeah.
music and do it. It's not the 1800s anymore. We don't have to sit and sit and toil, with
Listen,
no entertainment. You know what I
listen
mean?
to a Year of Plenty
Yeah,
podcast
sit in
while you do it.
silence. Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. Listen to
Yeah.
the Year of Plenty podcast while you. I call it Netflix and process. You know what I mean? It's just like
Yeah.
Yeah.
sitting down.
Netflix and
That's a
that's a t-shirt right
that's a
there.
Oh yeah.
t-shirt right there. I like
But
that.
yeah, it's just like find something you like to do. That's kind of what you kind of do to relax anyway, and just add the processing element into it. Or better yet,
Mhm.
get a bunch of friends together and do it as a community, and then
Exactly.
everyone can go home with their own sack of nuts, which is kind of what I'm working toward. I'm trying to work toward these more community-based processing, and me doing this by myself makes almost no difference in anything. Me teaching others makes a little bit of a difference, but us doing it together makes a lot of difference, because
But
then people
Right.
start going, what are they doing? You know what I mean? And like, if we can truly make it this community, like, no payment, no nothing, no none of this stuff. Like, you come, you work, you get your share, and everyone goes home with what they came to work on. And by doing it like that, we can process so much more. If I'm one person and can process 10 pounds of acorn flour by myself, imagine what 10 people could do. You know what I mean? On each step.
right.
So, same thing with
Yeah.
all the other nuts. I
No,
mean, I think that
totally.
community based.
The difference
Mhm.
being the different you mentioned, like, make a difference. The difference being more people interested in it, more people looking at it as a food source, and actually going out and taking from the landscape, but then also reciprocating and wild tending. And you touched on some of the wild tending.
Exactly.
You touched on some of that earlier, and the wild tending is something that we are really trying to improve upon this year too, and for the future. And that's a big message I want people listening to take home. It's like, you don't just want to take from the landscape, but also go out and wild tend. So with that, for the hickories, one, maybe we can talk about quick where people find hickories, like kind of what the ideal environment would be. And then also, because that's important for the wild tending too, right? You mentioned earlier taking nuts and then planting them once you kind of know where they grow. How do you then, like, how do you decide where to plant the hickories?
So as far as planting them, as of right now, until I run out of space, I just plant them at, like, so we have like a mature riparian forest right beside our home. It's a floodplain, and so on the upper portion of that is typically where I would spread the nuts. Um, or if there's like a special one, I might plant it in like a tree tube and kind of keep it and find a place on the property to plant it. Because I've already planted American chestnut, Chinese chestnut, oaks, and I have a northern pecan that I want to plant too. But we're running out of space for trees, unfortunately. Um, I,
Such is life.
yeah, I mean, you know how it is. Since we live next to a mature forest, we have a ton of shade. Which, if we play it properly, we should be able to be fine even with the shade. Just kind of working with forest dynamics in general. But to get back to your point, where I'd look for the trees, like I said, is in urban areas. In the wild, shagbarks they like water. You're going to find them closer to in riparian zones, but you also will sometimes see them like more in drier ridgeline areas. They're pretty adaptable, so you kind of see them a little bit of in kind of different environments, but you're going to want to look for that shaggy bark on them. And that's a pretty, shagbarks are probably one of the more easy trees to identify, especially because the bark exfoliates off the tree, and it almost looks like the bark is falling off the tree, shag bark. And you can also use that bark to make like a poor man's maple syrup by boiling it and adding sweetener and kind of making like a faux maple syrup.
Yep.
And then some people use it to smoke meat, or you can use it as an incense as well. We burn it in our house sometimes, and it smells really good. It smells like hickory chips, basically.
Yeah,
which is I mean, people use
that sounds
that hickory
great.
wood all the time for smoking, and from the history reading I've done, that was a big use for the hickory back in the day, and still is today. It's just for smoking.
Oh yeah, and hickory is just an amazing tree in general. The grain is super because I'm a woodworker as well. I don't do that a whole lot anymore. I kind of do it in the winter times. But hickory is a very, very strong and flexible wood, which is why hickory is like the uh, probably the best choice for a tool handle, because the grain is really long, and strong and intertwined, and also it's kind of got some flex to it, so it makes great tool handles like for axes and things like that. So hickory is all around are just a pretty amazing tree.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, yeah, and I did see that actually in some of the historical research I was doing. That yeah, tools like axe handles, like you mentioned, shovels, and then also wheels. They were used for the hickory by the early European settlers.
Oh
It just
yeah, you
yeah,
know what's interesting about wooden wheels is pretty crazy. Is that wooden wheels had three types of woods. So in the middle, the actual where the axle would come in, it needed to be really really dense and strong, and they would often use elm because elm has such a swirly grain that it is impossible kind of to shatter. And then on the spindles they would use hickory, and then for the outside the wheel, the actual wheel part that they would put the metal on top of, they would use oak because you can actually bend oak really easily. So it's interesting how like you can they knew the properties of these three woods, and so it's not as simple as just a wooden wheel. There's a reason why each wood was used for each part of the wheel, and I
that's
just think that's kind of
awesome.
amazing.
That's super
It's
amazing.
just a
That's
testament to
sweet.
how people understood the land
Yep.
so much on a deeper level that wasn't just like, oh, yeah, you used wood to build with. It's like, no, they use specific types of wood for specific things for specific reasons. And that is just like so incredible to me. Um, even bark canoes and all that type of stuff. Like people just had such a better understanding of the environment around them and
Well,
what
we're
everything was for.
we're hoping to get back to that. That's it's all
Yeah.
part of the mission, for I think a lot of us who like to be educators around these natural resources. So, one thing I'm curious about, you mentioned shagbark hickory a lot. So, it sounds like that's the species you like to go after for the most part. Is that right?
That's the most abundant species you're going to find, and which is great because they have really, really good nuts. The lesser one you'll find that I like too is called a shellbark, and the shellbark, or sometimes called the king nut, um, is it has a bigger nut and more nut meat inside. But you just don't see those as often. There's only a couple parks I know that have like nice open canopies that produce a lot of nuts. But last year I found out that a lot of them were empty. So it's kind of like
Hmm.
you're kind of like a detective. You're trying to figure out what's going on, and you're trying to figure out why are these nuts empty? Should I come back here next year and try again? Maybe there's like a pollination problem or something like that. Like, so you're always like, every time I'm walking around, in the neighborhood or in someone else's neighborhood or something, I'm always like looking around, and, you see some nuts on the ground. You're like, what kind of nuts are those? You know what I mean? Like, where are they coming from? Where's the tree that they came from? Like, it's a really fun game, kind of, and we can play these games right now because we don't have to rely on this for sustenance. Let's
Right.
be honest. We could go to the store if we needed to, but it allows us the opportunity to learn, in kind of a consequence-free way. Um, because while I do know a lot and I've been doing this for a long time, I learn something new, or I learn multitudes of things that are new every single year. I feel like every year nature makes me believe that I actually don't know anything. um,
Isn't that true?
I mean, every year's different, and it's like depending on the weather and the things that happen, you become much more observant of the weather. Last year we had some very weird weather events. Very dry when it was usually wet, very hot when it was usually not that hot, and so like for example, our pawpaw season last year was very poor, because I think that all the trees dropped their fruit, because it was so dry, when they were supposed to be setting fruit. So you
Hmm.
start to really, the deeper in my pursuit of trying to find more wild food, I feel like I've learned more about nature than I could in any book. because I'm simply observing nature
Right.
and drawing these conclusions based upon time. Experience is knowledge over time, right? So it's okay to have the knowledge, and a lot of people have knowledge nowadays, and that's great. But I feel like a lot of people stop there. You need to continue that pursuit, because knowledge over time is how you can gain the experience to know, like, hey, this year reminds me of 10 years ago when we had this abnormal weather event, and this is kind of what happened. So you can predict what's going to kind of happen this year. Like, for instance, this year we've got tons and tons of rain, and it's been abnormally hot. So I can predict that summer mushrooms are coming early, and they're going to stay longer as long as it keeps raining. And that prediction is starting to come true with some findings on iNaturalist with some chanterelles in our region, which is about 2 to 3 weeks early compared to other years.
Yeah. And that's really, I mean, that's where the wisdom comes from. And that's when you're really going to step into that realm of like being a true forager and like steward of the land almost, because you're so in tune with your
Mhm.
environment, and you really know how things are different year after year. And that is the thing with nature. I mean, even with gardening, this natural environment, the challenges with rain or cold weather, like we just had snowfall 4 days ago here in Montana.
Yeah.
That's why we haven't started seeds
That's
yet.
crazy.
And
We had a bunch of snow.
yeah, but
That
that's
is
just
insane.
all things that people need to, if they really want to get good and really want to kind of step to the next level, especially if beginners are listening. That's the kind of stuff you have to pay attention to, and maybe even do like a foraging journal. What I like to do is I like to go back, and I have a lot of pictures, so I go back looking at my pictures, kind of like, okay, what time of the year did I find this? That's why I always take so many pictures
Yep.
too. It's like you're
Exactly. I mean, I do the same thing. Like, you geotag them. Basically, you're like, okay, I found this on this day last year. So I'm going to go out looking maybe a week beforehand to start,
yeah,
you know?
Hmm.
But
yeah,
yeah, I always encourage people, it's like, even with my classes, I teach, I took over 200 people out this spring to teach them in various classes, not all at once, and kids and all kinds of different things. And, I tell every class, I'm like, I'm not here to like just spit information at you the whole time, because what I want to do is try and inspire you to go on your own learning journey, but I'm trying to get into your mind a perspective of thinking that I'm sure that you guys share with me, which is that we need to look at this past the novel, and we need to look at this as a lifestyle that and traditions that we can start and pick up again. And once people start
continue,
and
because the
continue,
lifestyle
yes,
has been
exactly.
lost.
Yes.
Yeah.
Lost and taken. And so,
Hmm.
it's like I try to encourage people the best that I can to be like, hey, like, yes, a lot of the things I'm saying are awesome and interesting and unique, but like, I want you to get your boots on and go outside every week at least. And I always tell people, go find a spot conveniently close to your house that's like a trail in the woods or something, and just walk it and just be observant, and just do that once. If you can swing it once a week, do it. And if you do it once a week, you're going to notice that the ecosystem is not static, that it's ever changing and flowing, and trees are living and dying, and plants are coming and going throughout the year. And I think once you start doing that, you start really looking at nature in a different way, and you say, hey, like, this is just like a flowing river. This is not like I think a lot of people see the forest as this stagnant thing that they go into in the summertime. It's a chaos, of green, and they don't know any of the plants. Everything's poisonous, and they never see it in the fall. They never see it in the wintertime. They never see it really in the spring. It's just, oh, it's boating season. At least in Ohio, it's like, oh, it's boating season. We don't really do. I'm sure out your way, there's tons of hiking and hiking opportunities.
Hmm.
But here, hiking is not the main leisurely activity. It's RV camping, it's fishing, it's hunting, which those are kind of dying out as well. But or boating, or going to that or the beach at the reservoir. So it's a lot of just leisure activities that have nothing to do with actual nature. But the state parks just provide a backdrop to their activities. Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
yeah.
Yep, definitely.
We've been very far removed from the actual human experience, that you're describing. And that's how most people connect with nature. That's the only way they do it. But there are other ways, like
Mhm.
going out there and learning about hickory, for example, and all the other awesome countless plants and mushrooms that you can go after, and then hunting and even with fishing. I mean, I always say there's
Mhm.
once you start doing this stuff, there's so many rabbit holes that you'll never be
Oh
bored
yeah, I
again.
mean that's how I got to where I am today. I mean, like I said, I was a chef for many, many years, and I started with mushrooms because I was a broke cook, and I knew that chefs wanted these mushrooms, and I was a cook too, and I wanted to bring them to our restaurants and play with them and stuff. And so I used to just like, in my spare time, just go foraging, find a big giant flush of chicken of the woods, and be able to sell it to another restaurant for like $12, $15 a pound. You know what I mean? And
Right.
so, that's how I started. I foraged when I was young and throughout my whole life, but that was like when I first really started to fall down those rabbit holes because you're out there and you're out there a lot and you're out there with intention. You're out there on a mission to gather food. And then you start to notice other things that are associated with this time of the year that you're currently, hunting in. Just like when I'm sure that you're hunting, you might find like spruce tips or service berries or something like that.
Totally.
Then you try them for the first time and you're like, wow, this is amazing too. Maybe like maybe there's more to this than just you know, these novel things, right? Maybe nature
Mhm.
does really provide everything that we need if we reciprocate, if we know what we're doing, if we understand how these ecosystems work. Um,
Get out of our
and so
comfort
yeah, and
zone.
then eventually yeah, get out of our comfort
Yeah.
zone. And then eventually you're driving around with your truck looking for lawn and leaf bags, trying to gather nuts off the side of the road.
Yeah.
The natural
Knocking on
progression.
people's doors.
I don't ever really knock on people's doors. I don't go onto anyone's property.
Yeah.
But if I see that trees are overhanging a sidewalk, um, that's usually what I do. I've knocked on doors before, but it's really hard to explain to somebody that you're just there to gather something and they just don't really kind of understand. They think that there's something else going on.
Yeah.
So I
Right.
try to just mind my own business, and if I see a tree out in the middle of nowhere or something, I'll go investigate. But if it's in someone's yard, I typically just leave it be, unless there's something like very, very, very unique about it. Then I might
Right.
go up and be like, "Hey, let me check that out."
Yeah, that is a good
Mhm.
point. Like with hunting, people know, okay, yeah, he's trying. I mean, it's how should I say it? It's common practice to knock on doors and ask people for permission to hunt, but for foraging, it's just such a strange concept for most people still that they're probably like, yeah,
Well,
what
and
is this
luckily, I'm
weirdo
not
doing
like
here?
gathering fruit off a tree and having to maybe potentially take a dead animal out of the woods. I think people see those as two different things. I see them as
Yeah.
kind of the same thing. You're harvesting an animal or you're harvesting fruit or whatever, but yeah, people just, we've kind of gotten to that disnification of animals and things like that. And so and I get it. I had to kill a groundhog the other day and I thought about eating it, and then I was like, man, I can't because it suffered for a while and because of my dogs, and so I had to finish it off, and I ended up burying it. But you know, animals live, animals die, everything lives and
Mhm.
everything dies, and it's like we just have to do it the best way we can. Even picking
Right.
picking fruit, like do it the best way you can. You don't have to rip the leaves off the tree, you don't have to break the branches off the tree to get the fruit. You know what I mean? It's kind of the same
Yeah.
concepts.
Although some plants like that, it's like the herbivore action. Like herbivores when they're
Mhm.
It
picking
does,
certain
but I
berries.
what I try to tell people with that though is that you really need to start to before you start kind of banking on that concept, you really have to understand, like try and be gentle at first, and then as you get more used to this and you get more used to how plants respond to these things. This is kind of my problem with like the social media stuff is that people say a lot of things without context, um, or they don't have enough time really to say all the little intricacies that are associated with this and these different concepts. And sometimes I feel like it's at the detriment of the people that are listening because they only get this little snippet of information. And completely believe in like herbivory and all those things, and I practice them, but it's taken me a long time to actually understand why and how we're doing them. And I really urge people to understand why they're doing something before they just go out and start doing it. You know what
Right.
I'm saying?
Yeah. And
Mhm.
it's obviously very
Definitely.
species dependent too. Sweet. Well,
Yeah, exactly. All those little intricacies, you know what I mean? It's like, you can't explain that to somebody in like, an hour or 2 hour long class. Like it's something that they need to pursue on their own, and they need to have, what I'm trying to do is instill a respect and try to instill that reciprocity aspect into it first before they start on their learning journey, so that they can go off of a good foundation of like, okay, so everything that I do, I need to have the land and these plants and these animals in mind. You know what I mean?
yep.
Mhm.
Instead of it just being like a free for all, like back when my grandpa was doing this stuff, it was kind of just like everyone kept to themselves. Don't take my spot. Don't touch my places. I'm not going to tell you. And nobody shared any information because everything had this price tag on it, right? Like ginseng, golden seal, these things, which
Right.
I don't know if you guys are familiar with those, but
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a really good point. Start really instilling that in people, in beginners first in their mind. And I'm happy to, I mean, it's good that we're talking about it now because it's something, like I said, that I want to really
Mhm.
focus on more with my podcast and video going forward. It's just really teaching that respect.
stewardship first,
Yeah.
stewardship led education. You know what I mean? It's like if we can't learn to see these plants as beings just similar to us, not in a way that's romanticized, like they can talk to us or we can talk to them, but that these beings are just as complex as us, if not more so complex. Just because they can't speak or whatever, like, our mouths often get us into trouble. So maybe mouths and speaking is not the highest form of evolution. Do you know what I'm saying?
All right.
But
Mhm.
you know, uh, these species have been around longer than us, and I think if we pay them the respect they deserve, um, and we learn about them, and I think paying respect means learning about them, learning how they grow, learning how they die, learning how we interact with them, and how when we do interact with them, how we can do it in a positive way. I think all those things and trying to instill that first is going to propel us faster into the future.
Yep. Into a
Mhm.
better
Definitely.
foraging community as a whole. Sweet. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's powerful stuff, man. Back to Hickory though. I got a few more questions there that I really want to get out. Lindy, you got a question? Do you want to ask?
Yeah, I was wondering how they taste compared to other nuts that people are used to. Like, is it gonna be fairly similar in taste and texture to pecans and everything, or is it kinda its own secret realm?
I mean, I feel like it's a pecan on, it's a pecan times four, maybe.
Like in
Okay.
like in
The size of
tastefulness
it
or
gives it some point deductions. Yeah, taste wise, I think it tastes like a nice buttery pecan. Um,
Yeah.
you know, and that's not, surprising, obviously, because pecans kind
Mhm.
of evolved, and maybe I don't want to say this for a fact, but I don't know if they were cultivated by humans over time for pecans, or if it's a separate evolution of the hickory. That's not something I am going to say that I know. I would assume that pecans were a little bit more cultivated just because of the nut being bigger, the shell being thinner, and all these different things. Hickory nuts, they definitely have a taste that's very, very similar, if not almost identical to a pecan. Texture wise, about the same. I think they're far more butterier. I think they have a higher fat content, maybe,
Mhm.
which probably doesn't lend them well to being shelf stable.
right?
Um, as far as like out of the shell, you know what I mean? The more nuts or
Right.
the more fat a nut has, the less time it'll last on the shelf.
Mhm.
Out of the shell anyway. So
Yeah.
yeah, to answer your question, they're pretty much like in my opinion, a better pecan.
Mhm. And then do you have any uses for the shells once you've taken the nut out? Or is it kind of a compost situation?
There's definitely still flavor to be retained. I've used the shells for smoking like meats and stuff like that. I've also used the shells as a flavoring agent and just like kind of boiling them and kind of extracting that flavor and using it in different capacities. Um, one of my friends who's an herbalist, she even made a tincture. I think she used the
Mm,
bark, but you could use the nuts as well, the shells as well. She made like a
okay.
woodland tincture with spicebush and hickory and one more thing I can't remember, but it's just like a very nice woodland type smell that you can use as like a cologne or a perfume, or I've even used it in like different dishes I've done to kind of add a little bit of like a woodland flavor, if you could even call that a flavor.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely a
It's
flavor.
more of a mindset, really, you know.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Very
Yeah, I mean,
cool.
I'm really excited about them. I wish we had them here. I lived in Wisconsin for a while, but I never really went after the hickories, just the black walnuts. But yeah, I mean, my parents are still there, so we're gonna be there this summer, which actually kind of brings me into the next question: is when is the prime time to go harvest them? When are you starting to really pay
I tip
attention?
I would say Wisconsin might be a little bit. I couldn't say for Wisconsin. It could be about the same time we harvest ours. I'm not completely sure. But I usually typically start harvesting around early September. Really just depends from year to year. But it's one of those things that you're just out in the woods, and you just, as long as you're kind of vigilant and observant, you can start to see when the nuts start falling. First, what happens is the squirrels start cutting off nuts off of the branches. And then you can it's kind of a favor though, because you can see how the nuts are developing, because typically the trees are so tall that you can't really see the nuts up there. But when they do that, you can kind of see how far along the nuts are, so to speak, and so you can kind of time it from there. I would say anytime in September, all the way until October,
Mm,
they'll be dropping. But just like anything else, you want to get there as quick as you can, just so that you can make sure you're getting good ones, and you don't want them to be laying on the ground for too long. They'll be fine for a while, but from other things getting a hold of them, and then just like maybe even molding if it's wet or something like that, getting to them earlier than later is probably for the best. But again, like I said, urban areas are better because people maintain the areas under the trees as well.
Right.
And when they do that, a lot of times you don't have nearly as many weevils. A lot of nuts get weevils in them, right? And
mm,
it's for acorns as an example. Indigenous peoples would often burn around oak trees, in turn creating oak savannas. But this would also kill the hibernating uh, acorn weevil, and it would increase their harvest up to like almost 90% or something like
Wow.
that, at least based on what I've read. So just a simple act of burning, again, understanding what's really going on, understanding the bigger picture. You can get bigger harvests. Also, like I said, they maintain the area underneath, which means that they clean up all of the old nuts, which is really important because if you're gathering and you're picking up 2/3 of nuts from last year, because they're mixed in with the nuts from this year, you're going to be pretty disappointed when you go home and most of them float.
Right.
Also,
right.
the more debris on the ground, the more pests you're going to have to deal with. So, the fact that people clean up their yards and maintain the areas around them, and as far as like pesticides and stuff go, I'm not really worried about that with nuts. Even if they do spray, they're not going to be spraying at the time of year, and also the tree is kind of like the giant filter for those pesticides, unfortunately. But by the time they reach the nuts, I mean, there's
Well,
I've read studies that have said that there's not much, there's not anything to be concerned about as far as levels of pesticides getting to the nuts. But from what I found, again, when you're scouting out areas, you can tell when people don't use chemicals. A lot of people in urban areas don't really use chemicals. There's except maybe on their driveway or something.
yeah, more just
Mhm.
selectively on the weeds. And the thing is, though, yeah, like you're saying with nuts, they have such a hard shell, and unless it's somehow getting through the roots into the tree and then into the nuts, but I think that's relatively unlikely. I think it's more of an issue of them actually getting sprayed, and people probably aren't going to spray the nuts on the tree. And even if they do, the shell is so thick. Like even with a lot of vegetables like avocados, it's a bit less of a concern because they have that shell. Um, so that's
Yeah,
something
and
to
the
consider.
husk on the outside of the shell too, which makes it even
Right.
more of a a barrier to entry. But yeah, people worry a lot about pesticides and stuff. And what I say is, I typically don't harvest greens or anything off the ground like mushrooms in urban areas, but things that are on shrubs like berries or, like service berries or nuts or persimmons or anything like that. I'm not too worried about those. It's also about, what's your own comfort level. I don't think there's any such thing as no pesticides, period. Like everything's kind of been infiltrated with some of those traces.
Mhm.
Sadly,
Um,
yeah.
but it's more about your own personal risk and what you're willing to do, and also just harvesting from clean areas in general. I mean, I go to the nicer part of the town. Where sometimes I go to the not so nice part of town when I get apples and pears. So I mean, there's all kinds. It's just about individual situations. You know what I mean? I don't want to make any broad rules of like, oh, never go here or never go there. It's just more about common sense. I'm not going to harvest greens off the ground where dogs pee and stuff like
Yeah,
that. You
or
know
the
what I mean?
ditch.
Yeah.
The road ditches, I think, are a big no-no for me usually, just because all that
Yeah, road
runoff.
ditches or like along railroad tracks, those chemicals, those ties are like soaked in like um, just like chemicals to keep them from rotting, and it leaches down into the soil. So,
Yeah,
but as far as like tree crops and things like that, I think you're much more lenient in that realm. So with
yeah,
hickory
Mhm.
nuts, I just look for clean areas and, like I said, even better if they've bagged them up for me already. So.
right.
Mhm.
Um,
Is there a way to tell if the nut is good or bad without having to go through the effort of cracking it open and taking it home?
Oh yeah, for one, if it has a hole in it, that means that there was a weevil inside and it's probably bad. Number two, the best thing to do is just to take all your nuts home, fill up your bathtub with water and just dump them in. And
Mm.
the ones that are bad are going to float and the ones that aren't bad will sink. And you take the sinkers and you cure those. I also will go through the bad nuts, so to speak, the floaters, because sometimes you'll get some that float and they're good inside. So I'll go through those a little bit. And, if I see a one that looks kind of good, it's like a light color, it's not dark and black. I'll crack it open and see how it is. I'll usually try to use the floaters first if I find some good ones in there. And then all the
Mhm.
sinkers, I will dry out, cure with the fan, just like I said, and then store for long-term storage. Because I typically only crack them when I need them.
Right.
so you cure them
Gotcha.
first, though, and
I made a
then
hickory nut pie last Thanksgiving. What would you say?
I was saying you cure them first, like you mentioned earlier, and then whenever you need to, or whenever you feel like having some, you will crack them.
Yeah, they just have a much better storage life. If I cracked them and had them out, I would either have to refrigerate them or usually I'll just throw them in the freezer when they're out of the shell. And, the more things I don't have to put in the freezer and fridge, the better off I am because I have berries and stuff like that in the freezer. So usually the freezer space is pretty a hot commodity.
Oh,
So
yeah.
anything I can keep out of the freezer is just better for us. You know what I mean?
Yeah, our freezers are definitely some treasured space.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
So,
well, I'm sure you
yeah.
guys. You guys. It seems like you do a lot of hunting. So if that's the case, I'm sure your freezers are stocked.
They are.
Yeah.
They are. That was always the big goal. As much as I love foraging and plants as a food source, I still get the most excited about good quality protein as a food source, and nutrition wise, that's what I'm really seek out the most every year.
Oh yeah, it's
Mhm.
funny. It's like we're kind of doing the same thing but opposite. I just got really
Yeah.
engrossed in foraging, and I'm trying to get more into, excuse me, hunting and fishing. And it seems like you're a big hunter, and you're trying to get more into foraging. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, just trying
Yeah,
to do it
definitely.
all at once, which also can be challenging at times, but
Oh,
it's
for sure.
it's
I mean, it's
fun.
definitely a transition. I kind of started my transition with like local food. You know what I mean? I started just buying, when I used to buy food at the grocery store. I started working on a mushroom farm for a while, and then we opened up our own little farmers market. And then I started transitioning to more local food, and then obviously started growing food and foraging food. And now I want to hunt food and fish for food and do all that stuff. So it really is a progression that takes a lot of time, because we weren't taught this stuff obviously when we were kids. So, or at least not in
Mhm.
any real kind of sense. Hunting even is more of a recreational pursuit, right? It's not really most people don't have the goal of, I'm going to get enough meat to last me the year. It's more of like, I think deer hunting or whatever is fun, at least in my area, that's kind of how it is.
Yeah.
Mhm.
We try to do it for the sustenance part of it all.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, that's the
And
most
and, you
Yep.
know, it's a fun adventure too, you know what I mean?
Yep.
totally.
Yeah, I personally don't like the taste of beef usually, 'cause we grew up on elk and deer and everything wild, so if there's a chance to have something not raised on a farm, that's what I would prefer. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I wish I kind of wish I had that experience growing up. My dad hunted, but it was in my younger childhood and like I said, most people in our area do it for more of a recreational pursuit. And so they
Mhm.
basically take their whole deer and they just turn it into ground beef basically.
Right.
Yeah,
And I think that's a little bit of a tragedy because I feel like there's so many different parts that could be used and cooked in different ways, but to each their own in that retrospect. Some people just don't want to deal with they just want to deal with one kind of thing. You know what I mean?
right.
Right. We personally love burger just 'cause it is so easy to do, but having the different steaks and backstrap and stuff, that would be a shame to have as burger.
Oh yeah, and that's kind of what I meant. Like they'll have the back straps and then
Oh,
ground and
no.
that's it. So it's like because I think there's some beautiful roasts and stuff on venison as well.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Um, you know, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah,
Y
like we like to keep a lot of the shoulder as like taco roasts. Then a lot like flat iron is we really got experimental last year especially, and there's so many cuts in there beyond the back straps that you don't need to turn into burger. Even though like Lindy said,
Yep.
we love burger and it's very in a day to day it's the easiest and the most nutritious I think, because you can add
Yeah.
quality fat to it, and then it fuels me the best I think. But there's a lot out there,
Mhm.
or a lot from an animal like that you can get experimental with in the kitchen.
Oh, for sure.
Mhm.
And that's the coolest part, It's like every year you get it and eventually you start getting bored with certain things and you're like, let's try it different this year. I feel the same way about my preservation techniques, every year I'm like, how could I do this a little bit differently? You know what I mean? How could I
Yeah.
preserve this in a different way? I like to preserve a lot of my stuff very plainly so that when I need it or I want it, I can have the freedom to do what I want with it in that moment
Totally.
versus being kind of subjugated to one certain thing, like even for berries, I don't really make jam. I just freeze the berries whole so that I can take them out and do whatever I want with them. And maybe sometime I'll make jam, but um, I like the freedom to be able to do what I want with it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yep.
One shout out I wanted to do, to Jesse from Feral Foraging, who I had him on the podcast recently. He had a great video on Hickory, because you mentioned the whole part of going in urban areas because it's cleared out underneath. He went out in his video with a rake, found a hickory spot, and actually, well before they started dropping, cleaned up the whole area with his rake, got rid of all the old nuts and ground cover and whatnot, the leaves. And then, when the nuts started falling, he had like access to all the ripe or perfect nuts, I guess you would say, right there without having to pick through the old ones and whatnot. I thought that was really cool. So I want to give him a shout out there.
Oh yeah, I think I saw that video. But that's like and he's great. That's a prime example of stewardship. You know what I mean? It's like you start to, I really feel like if we want to have a real connection with nature, we have to find something there that we like and that we feel like we're getting something in return, like a little treat or something. And then we start to just get more and more invested in it. And then next thing you know, you're going out to a random park with a rake and you're raking up um, nutshells just so you can have a better harvest. You know what I mean? And that helps the tree too, because the less weevils and the less pests and stuff that attack the nuts, the more there's a chance for those genetics to be able to spread versus them all just being chopped up by the mower or just decaying on the ground with no chance to ever become another next generation hickory tree, because it takes sometimes 30 to 40 years for a nut tree to produce a good crop of nuts.
Wow. That's
So you're
Wow.
truly planting nut trees with the future in mind. You're not planting them so that you can necessarily enjoy them anytime soon. As with like a fruit tree, right? Like it's year 3 for our peaches and they already have some peaches on them. So, but fruit, if you
Mm.
plant a nut tree, you'll get nuts before that, but 2 to 5 nuts is not anything to write home about. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You want those crops where you have a whole bushel of nuts that you can actually do something with, right? So, yeah, you're not if you plant nut trees, which, you know, I'm kind of for whatever reason I fell in love with nuts, and so I'm kind of in the nut world now a little bit. And so in June, we're actually me and some guys who are doing research on this are going to go. They actually deal a lot with chestnut trees because for some reason American chestnut is very interesting to me. But we're going to go out and looking for mushrooms like boletes and chanterelles and black trumpets, and we are going to try to inoculate the roots of young chestnut seedlings to see if that
Mm.
mycorrhizal relationship can not only add more value for someone who wants to plant chestnut trees, but maybe even find ways to help the American chestnut battle blight by using mycorrhizal relationships.
that's
So
cool.
that'll be fun to do because I'm going to kind of lead them out on a foray so that we can find those mushrooms, and then we'll work and we'll do different experiments to try and create an inoculant that imagine if you inoculated the roots of chestnut trees in your orchard with uh you know some sort of really nice porcini. And then you had
Mm.
the crop of your chestnuts, but in the summertime, before the chestnuts are harvested, you get a huge flush of porcini that you could dry and sell as a secondary crop
That's
that
Oh
genius.
that
man.
needs no tending.
That is the dream.
Yeah, I will.
So yeah, thinking in these aspects, you know what I mean. I think that we can all come up with ideas like because this wasn't my idea, but we can come up with ideas such as this that is like, hey, like how can we take the areas? A lot of landowners have wooded property. How can we kind of see the forest through the trees in a sense and see the forest not just for the trees, but for what those trees provide in totality with the entire food web, right? Because when we look at it that way, we can start to see, okay, well, there's cool mushrooms that are very highly prized edible mushrooms that come up with only these mature trees. So that means we cannot cut down the trees because these mushrooms cannot be cultivated in a indoor environment. So we must keep the forests in order to have that crop of mushrooms as well. You know what I mean? It's just kind of thinking in ways like that. Just like Samuel Thayer does he does ramps in his sugar bush. So he has all the sugar maples, and so he gets the ramps and it's the perfect environment for ramps. And so he tends his ramp patches and is able to sell ramps sustainably and also sell maple syrup from the same area of his forest.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
Yeah, that is next level stuff. And if you have your property like that and you have a homestead, that's a whole new avenue for a lot of people to get into. And I'd love to have you on again after you run that experiments with your friends there to see, if it worked and whatnot. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. It might be like 7 to 10 years from now.
Yeah. Hey, we're still doing the
Perfect.
No, we'll be
podcast
able to
Just
then.
see
set the
some
date.
some results before then. But these mycorrhizal relationships we're just now starting to understand. And I mean, honestly, if you wanted to do another episode, we could do it all about mycorrhizal relationships between trees and mushrooms and other plants because I think that is an entire the multiverse exists, but it's all right here. You know what I mean? Like there are multitudes of things going on from the smallest organisms in our soil to like these celestial bodies, right? So it's like we're focused out here in the macro when it's like the micro is really where a lot of stuff is happening. I really believe in the like as above, so below concept. You know what I mean? So it's like, there's a lot of repeating things that are happening in these ecosystems. And by applying those things we know about the macro to the micro, maybe we can start to make more advancements in how we can steward lands and how we can interact in that way.
Right.
And indigenous people knew this already. They just didn't have these fancy names and Latin names and all that stuff for it. These were stories that were passed down that taught these lessons.
Yeah, that were unfortunately kind of lost and taken from them. We're trying to learn more about that whole aspect of the indigenous food systems that once were too. Going back to hickory though, to
Mhm.
kind of touch on a little bit more on the wild tending side. I don't think you mentioned this yet in our conversation. Like, how do you do anything to the nuts before you would go plant them, or do you literally just pick them up and plant them? And is it like, do you take them in the hull? Do you know? Or do you take the hull off before you plant them? Like, how do you kind of approach that?
Oh no, you would just actually stratify them. So basically, you take the nuts that you want to plant and you put them in a bag and you just put them in the fridge. You could put them in some substrate as well if you wanted to put them in some sterilized potting soil or sand, or some guys have their own special mixes. But then you just put them in a Ziploc bag with a little bit of moisture and you put them in the fridge. And you would ideally do this before the curing process. Like you want to get them fresh, float them, see if they're good. And once you find out they're good, then you would put them in the bag in the freezer to stratify them. And so stratification is the process that these nuts need to go through, which is simulation of a winter, essentially. You could also directly just plant them in the ground, but it's a lot less of a guarantee because anything could happen over the wintertime. What a lot of guys I've seen do, which is interesting and also really cool, is you take a pop can, you cut the top off the pop can, and then you plant your nut, and then you put the you plant it, and then you take the open pop can and you insert it into the soil around the nut. And so over the winter time, it protects the nut from squirrels digging into it because that aluminum case is around the nut even underground. And then by the time spring rolls around, it provides a tiny little greenhouse for that sapling, and then eventually it rusts off, or you could physically take it off in the spring.
Okay.
Hmm.
So, and then after you stratify the seeds in the fridge, if that's the route you choose, then you could just plant them out. A lot of guys use air pruning boxes. You could use tree tubes, or you could just plant it directly in the ground. Then, anytime you plant a seed directly in the ground, though, especially for nuts, you got to be careful because there's a lot of things out there that want that nut. And so, a lot of times, what I would do is just plant the seedlings in a place I can control until um, it's time to transplant them out.
That makes
But with
sense.
with nut trees especially, you got to be careful because they have a tap root, and if you basically mess with that tap root, they might not make it or ever become a true hickory tree. That taproot
Mm.
is essential, and things like fruit trees don't really have that taproot. But oaks and hickories and these things do. So you have to be very careful, and that's why you plant them in the tree tubes so that they have a long way to go, so that taproot is not disturbed.
Awesome. Yeah,
Right.
those are great tips. So when do you know if they're done stratifying?
It's just you just kind of it doesn't. Some people are scientists about it. I'm not really that way. I'm kind of like I just throw the bag in the fridge when I harvest nuts, and then in the spring I take it out, and they should be good.
Okay.
You know what I mean? It doesn't. I think people try to. I guess I'm being a little bit nonchalant about it, but at the same time, I feel like people often overcomplicate. I think with the social media educators, they are constantly needing content, so they are constantly like kind of revisiting and rehashing things over and over and over again, and it really complicates matters because nature is complicated, but it's not you know it's also pretty simplistic in its mechanisms. So, like I said, we're simulating winter. So, you know, if you throw that bag into the fridge in the fall, um, by the time spring rolls around, it's about the time that seed would be waking up anyway. And the seed will actually usually germinate in the bag, which is perfectly fine. And as long as it's not too overgrown, and then you can just pop it in the soil and it could be a great segue into the greenhouse, but I usually put mine into my greenhouse first and let them kind of be a little bit protected from the throes of early spring so that they develop a nice straight sapling. And then I will take them out and transplant them, or I'll let them grow in the tree tube for a year. And then when they're dormant, transplant them. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it. And there's a lot of experimentation that can be done. My main advice is just to don't overcomplicate don't overcomplicate it. You know what I mean? Just
Right.
follow the simple mechanisms, and you should be okay. You know, no matter what, you always want to grab more nuts than you're going to plant, because some of them aren't going to germinate. Some of them are going to come out weird.
Mhm.
Some of them may germinate and then die. So always overseed and then take the best ones out, and go with that, because guess what? Every year you got a new chance to do it. So if you mess it all up the first time, all you got to do is wait 12 months and you can try again.
Love that.
Yep.
Totally.
It's the best thing about it.
Right.
Mhm.
So yeah, I guess to close off the hickory section, I just want to share quick a little bit of history I found on a USDA website. Um, just two little passages here. The first one kind of speaks on the earliest record of hickory use by humans, and I guess the species is, we didn't really talk about that, but it's Korea. Is that how you say it? Right, Korea. Or that's the genus, right? Korea. Ovata is the shagbark, and then Korea cordiformis is the bitternut. So they say here that the earliest record of man's use of Korea species comes from archaeological excavations near both the northern and western edges of Korea distribution. Hickory and pecan were recovered in strata dated from the early Archaic, which is 8,900 to 8,700 years ago. I thought that was pretty crazy because you don't often see plants preserved in the archaeological record. But maybe
Mhm.
it goes back to what you were saying earlier, that especially the nuts kind of can preserve really well if done right. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and from what I've heard, that there used to be a lot more hickory species until, or more diverse range of hickory species until the last ice age, and then they kind of all got pushed south, and then kind of retook back over the north as the glaciers receded, thus kind of pushing their diversity down. So who knows what existed before then, as far as like different types of hickory nuts and things like that.
Right.
Hopefully we got the best of them, but you
Yeah.
never know. We could have got the worst of them.
True. Well, you'd
Yeah.
think
No kidding.
you'd think we got the best because up until a few hundred years ago, Native Americans were cultivating them, and that's actually the second passage I want to share. It's also on that USDA website, and they have a passage from William Bartram, 1792, and he reported in his journal that ancient cultivated fields of hickory west of Augusta. So they were cultivated fields of hickory that he saw, and he said that though these are natives of the forest, yet they thrive better and are more fruitful in cultivated plantations. And the fruit is in great estimation with the present generation of Native Americans, particularly Juglans exaltata, which commonly called shell-barked hickory. I don't know if that's still the scientific name for it. But he goes on to say, I've seen above 100 bushels of these nuts belonging to one family. They pound them to pieces and then cast them into boiling water, which, after passing through fine strainers, preserves the most oily part of the liquid. This they call by the name which signifies hickory milk. It is as sweet and rich as fresh cream, and is an ingredient in most of their cookery, especially hominy and corn cakes. So yeah, I thought that was really cool. Just having an actual.
Yeah, not gonna lie,
Hmm.
guys, that's totally correct. Like the hickory nut milk is so delicious. It's I don't know if you've ever tried that Malk brand pecan milk,
No.
but that's pretty
Mm-mm.
good too. But it's got all the artificial emulsifiers in it. But man, hickory nut milk with some maple syrup and a little bit of spicebush as a spice in there, and it is so good. Especially if you use one of those little emulsifier things like for your coffee, and you get a nice like
Yeah.
foam on top. Man, it is like the most warm and like woodsy. I mean, it's like you drink it and you close your eyes, you're like transported to like, a cottage in Maine or something like that. That's how it feels like when you drink it, in like early October or something like that.
Awesome.
So,
That sounds so nice.
but it's also, that passage you read is great because it kind of just like rings true to what I've been saying of like, we kind of think of these indigenous like hunter gatherers, or if that's what you want to say, but in reality, they were tenders of nature's garden. And even some people claim that the Amazon rainforest is like a garden that just hasn't been tended in a long time, which is why it's the jungle now. And I could see our forest being the same way. It's like if you, there were literally civilizations of people here, not just little bands or groups. Like I live in Ohio, we have tons and tons of mound building culture remnants that these people were so fat and happy off the land that they could devote their time to building mounds for ceremonial purposes. Cultures don't do that unless they have a surplus. Surplus must be established before you can have a labor force that can do things that don't seemingly make sense for survival, right? Like, as far as we know, these mounds that they built have nothing to do with their survival. It's all this maybe possibly ceremonial and or religious point of view. And so we see that all across the world, in Egypt and Mesopotamia and all these different things where they build these monuments, because they did have a fertile valley or a fertile crescent or a river valley or something that they were able to um, live and procure things off the land. I would always tell people, people think Ohio is boring, but I view Ohio as a literal paradise. I can forage from January all the way to end of November if I wanted to. You know what I mean? Especially with the warmer winters we've been having. If it's not mushrooms, it's fruit. If it's not fruit, it's greens. If it's not greens, it's nuts or berries or whatever. So there's always something out there. And, the more we get involved with it, the more we become accountable for the landscape and the more we start planting these things on our property. My garden is like half native perennials, half annual
Mm.
crops, and they do really well together. And I bring in tons of pollinators and insects that eat pests and things like that just from introducing things like, dogbane, milkweed, American plum, American hazelnut, all these different things that I add to my garden just because I love the plants. We can use those little gardens as nucleuses for future plantings and crops. So, if I can grow out a really good American hazelnut on my property, I can take cuttings from that and I can move them down to my riparian forest where they should be. Or if I have my American plum, I can dig up the thickets it creates and I can move them to different parts of my property. And then from there, those seeds will spread via birds and animals and down the creek when they float down the creek and all these different things. And so by doing small acts like this in our own communities, in our own yards, we can have a ripple effect that we may never even know the magnitude of. But our children will, and our children's children will as well. So, us being here and us getting into this stuff and piecing it together is a job that I feel like, for me, I'm called to do in a way of like, for whatever reason, the knowledge that I've gained and the weird life that I've lived up until this point has all led me to this point, and sharing it with others, I think, would be a disservice to myself and other people. So, and I don't know everything, but I learn from others, and have a good way of conveying information that people seem to like. So why not just roll with that and just keep doing what I'm doing? You know
Right.
what I mean?
No, we need more
Mhm.
people like you. They can especially, keep talking and talking about a topic like that because you seem to have a lot of knowledge, and it would be a shame for that to go to waste and not be passed on to
Yeah,
more
it's
people.
it's so important, and I think it's important for people to realize that they can take very small steps to get to this big grand picture.
Hmm.
You can start with just a few things on your back porch and maybe find one wild plant you want to learn and go from there. Teach all your friends about the one plant.
For sure. And
Right.
what I tell people about wild plants is they want to grow here. If you have a black thumb, if you can't grow vegetables, like just plant native perennials. Perennials give back to the soil, annuals take from the soil. And so when you plant
Mhm.
perennials, even if you have a black thumb, that perennial is going to thrive and survive. Like what I tell people, you know what? If you can't grow potatoes, grow Jerusalem artichokes, sunchokes. You can plant the tuber. You can literally breathe on the tuber wrong and it'll sprout. Like, these plants want to grow here. And so you could just take a tuber and just throw it into your backyard. And in 2 years, you'll have a forest of Jerusalem artichokes with thousands of pounds of tubers underneath the ground ready to be harvested. So it's like,
Mhm.
we can do this, and we can do it very easily, and we can do it in small ways. And if a bunch of us do it, a bunch of us, if everyone planted one different type of native plant in their yard, those native plants could start to take back their native range, which could have effects that we don't even understand yet.
Right.
Mhm.
Sweet, man. Well, that was super helpful. Thanks for covering the hickory nuts with us so in such detail.
Yeah, sorry if I went on a bunch of tangents there, but
It's
I
That's
okay.
okay.
We love that.
it all, I mean, it's one thing to learn about these trees and stuff, and I kind of use wild food as a bait to get people to listen to my broader topics. But like, we have to understand the broader worldview and like the food web as a whole, in a sense, in order to really understand, like, what's the point? What's the point of harvesting these when we can just get them from the grocery store?
Right.
And what I say is that once you understand how an ecosystem works, you know that it's imperative that we do that.
Right.
Mhm.